Thanks for tuning in to the Medevac podcast, powered by the Robert Irvine Foundation, whose mission is to support and strengthen the physical and mental well-being of our nation's heroes and their families. I'm one of your hosts, David Reid.
And I'm your other host, Christian Meyers. Thank you very much for joining us today on the Medevac podcast. If you're new here, there's a price for the show. You have to share it with a friend or family member if you get something out of today's episode. We've got some pretty interesting guests today, so I think you're going to get something out of this one. Our guests, we have Travis Mills and Gene Pugh. Both joined the Army as infantrymen in 1966, so a couple of years ago. But we're here to talk to them about a little bit of their history, what they've done after their service, and what they're doing now. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. And almost the same time in 1996, I think a month apart.
Yeah.
Yes.
Correct?
Short period of time.
Short period of time.
Yeah.
What'd I say?
96.
1966.
66, yes.
Yes, that's quite a difference.
A couple of years.
So let's rewind it back a little bit in time and say, what inspired you gentlemen to join the military? And we'll start
Okay.
way back in February in 1966.
Well, back in, my wife and I got married in 1963. And at that time, things were relatively calm. Most of us had never even heard of Vietnam at that point in time. And I come from a very small town just north of Dallas up here. And in school, her brother and I were in the same class, and she was one class behind me. And so after we got out of school, we got married. And shortly after that, my brother-in-law got drafted. And so he went, and he was one of the very first ones. He went over with the very first group of the first Cav in 1964.
Wow.
And so he was there just as the war was kind of starting to get picked up. And it was starting to gain momentum. I was married, no children. So I was not on the top of the draft list. I was on the number 2 tier.
Okay.
And it just so happened that one of my best friends that I went to school with, his father was on the draft board for Collin County. So every month he would tell me, as long as we have single guys, then you're safe. You're not going to get drafted. And so this went on for probably pretty close to a year. And then finally one week he came by and said, yep, we're out of single guys this month and you're number 1 on the list. Because at that time I was like 24 years old.
Okay.
So I was getting up there pretty good. So as that month came along, I did not want to get drafted. And so I made up my mind I had another cousin that had been in the Air Force, but he had been stationed around an area up close to Fort Bragg and had heard about and saw some of the Special Forces stuff. So I started doing some research and was quite interested in being in the Special Forces. And at that time, it was still quite small and very, very almost unheard of.
Yeah.
And so my main goal was, when I went in, was to enlist and then sign up for Special Forces.
What about the Special Forces did you like specifically? Was it the unconventional warfare or better gear, better training?
It was just like being on the A team playing football.
There you go.
That's the A team.
Gotcha.
That's the good team.
And you don't get an option if you're drafted, right? I mean,
No.
it's
No.
the needs in the military at that point.
Exactly.
So you're like, I need to be proactive with this choice before I go in.
As a matter of fact, when I was in my sign-in down in Dallas, and we were all lined up and had taken our physicals and all that stuff, and we were getting ready to start loading on buses, and they had all the draftees line up and had them count off, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they all counted off, and they said, okay, number 3 man, all of you step forward. And they stepped forward. They said, you just joined the Marine Corps. Thank you very much. Bus is
man.
outside.
Wow.
Oh, man.
So you went where they told you, and that was the deal. What you signed up for. Another thing, another guy I went to school with was in my same class. He and I both joined the same day. We joined on the buddy plan. They had a buddy plan. You were supposed to stay with each other throughout your, quote, military career. Well, we went through basic training at Fort Hood together. At Fort Polk, I'm sorry, at Fort Polk. He went off to El Paso to field artillery, or aerial artillery school, and I went off to South Carolina for infantry training, and we never saw each other again the whole time we were in the Army. So much for the buddy plan.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, once you're in, you sign on the dotted line. It's whatever we
It's
decide.
just subject
is
to
the-
change really quickly.
So things could change. But if you did enlist, you did get somewhat of a choice. So that's the primary reason I enlisted. I kind of had the thing that, hey, we're getting in a war, and my dad had been to World War II. All of my uncles had been to World War II, and my cousins had all been drafted and served through the years, that, you know, through the Korean War and whatever. So it was just a tradition that you're going to go in the military. That's kind of the way it was.
And that legacy, especially in Texas, was the sense of patriotism, I'm sure, was quite prominent there as well. I
Yes.
mean, you're coming from a legacy of World War II and Korea as well.
Right.
I mean, how was that? I mean, did that influence? You said you were 24 by the time you joined. Why not 18? What were you kind of thinking?
Well, I went off to school and wound up drinking too much beer and chasing too many girls, so school didn't last very long. My dad didn't decide he was going to pay for me to just go party all the time. So I
So
had
that
to
problem
come back.
still existed.
And
Still exists today.
and went to work, and then my wife and I got married, and so it just had not worked in to getting into the military yet, because the Vietnam War hadn't really spun up yet.
Yeah.
So there wasn't any real reason to go other than just going for military service.
Sure.
Okay.
That makes
So
sense.
Okay.
that's why that, and then of course once I got married, it wasn't, well, I want to go, but at the same time the patriotic gene kind of started kicking in and says, hey, there's a war going on, and that's
And you're
what
going to
we
do
need
it on
to
your
do.
terms.
So
Yeah.
that's primarily why I joined.
Okay. And your story has to be probably pretty similar.
Sort of similar.
Is there a judge involved? I can see that on your face.
No, not quite. Almost. The thing about it was, I was going through my senior year in college up here at North Texas State University up in Denton. At that time, it was North Texas State University.
Yeah.
And I thought I was going to graduate. And then when we started looking at the figures, I was 3 hours short.
Oh.
And I was going to graduate what they call the winter commencement in February of '66. And I didn't have the money at the time to stay in just for the 3 hours. And because I had transferred in from Canal Zone College down in the Canal Zone in Panama. And there was a mix-up in the mathematics there. And so I knew that I was prime candidate for the draft. So after I figured that out real quick, in about a nanosecond, I said, I'm going to join up. So went down to the recruiting office, and the sergeant said, hey, you've got 4 years of college. We're going to make you a clerk typist. I don't want to be a clerk typist. But then I'm also looking at the draft. And so I said, okay. And he said, you can change your mind afterwards. I says, good. So went through basic training at Fort Polk, E32. Went through, and then when I was there in the first week or two, the in-service recruiters came in and take us down to the gym, to the theater. And you know, how many people do you want to become helicopter pilots? How many of you want to go through ASA? Who wants to be a paratrooper? Who wants to be a dog trainer or whatever it was? And at the far end was Sergeant First Class Lou Minor. I'll never forget that. And he had a green beret on, looking for volunteers. The heck with this being a Remington commando. And so I volunteered. A week or so later, I reported to the first sergeant because they called me in. Private Pugh reporting to the first sergeant. He says, "You're due for a physical, airborne physical." I did not volunteer for airborne. Listen to me, private. You volunteered for special forces, right? I go, yes. Well, you have to be airborne qualified to be in that outfit. And I'm looking at the clerk typist that was right there, and he was having all sorts of problems. And I said, "Yes, sir, I volunteered for, says, okay. Go dispensary number 3, I believe it was. He says, "You realize, private, there's only 2 things that fall out of the sky. Dumb shit and bird shits. Now, which one are you?" I guess I'm a dumb shit. He says, "Get the hell out of my office." So that was it. That was my indoctrination into to special forces. However, being born and raised in Central America, in Panama, the 8th Special Forces Group was already there. So I was semi-familiar with the men wearing the green beret. Didn't know all that much about them, just the fact that they looked different. And the other soldiers, how should we say, did not confront them. They walked down the sidewalk and they moved aside and they let them walk by. So yeah, there was a swagger with them, and I go, you know what? And then I heard they were the best. Right about that time, 1964, prior to that, I read an article that Roger Donlin had gotten the Medal of Honor in Vietnam, and he was a Green Beret. So that was the inspiration. And for those of us that were in Special Forces at the time, that was our hero. That was the legend.
Set the golden standard, if you will.
The golden standard, that was the man.
Yeah.
The man.
And that swagger was definitely appealing to
Oh,
you
yes,
as well.
definitely.
And did you kind of see yourself, your future self, in that clerk in that office?
No, I did not. After that, I did not.
You were like, I'm not going to be there.
No.
I definitely have a question. I kind of want to rewind it back, and we're talking 1960s here. The dissemination of information is totally different than
Yes.
this landscape that it is today. We didn't really have a format of what Vietnam looked like.
Exactly.
How were you hearing about it? Like, what was going on? What was said? What was going on in your family's conversations about this?
Uncle Walter, Walter Cronkite. That was the voice. Gene Reynolds and some of the other ones. Frank Reynolds. Was it Frank Reynolds?
Frank Reynolds.
Yeah, Frank Reynolds. And the other networks and so on, they were the voice. And there was no right-leaning or left-leaning. It was the news.
Yeah.
And they were impartial. As far as we were concerned, they were impartial.
As far as we knew.
As far as we knew. And so that's how we got our news. And then when we got into Special Forces, we were asked to read books. Street Without Joy by Bernard Fall. Excerpts of Mao Zedong's Little Red Book. The People's War from Che Guevara. Again, excerpts of Karl Marx, 1848, or Communist Manifesto.
Yeah.
And they gave us a little pamphlet, and I lost it over the years. but it was Sun Tzu, Art of War.
So they were giving you reading instructions based on
Right.
insurrectionist type activity.
Things of that nature.
Yeah.
So you had to
Makes sense.
recognize it and how to combat it.
Yeah.
And so
How
this
to
was-
identify it
How to
early.
identify it. And so this was part of our literature course, you know. And those of us that couldn't afford the book, because at the PX it was usually run out of the book, and so it was here. It's your turn to read it. So you run it real quick and then pass it on to the next guy, you know. So
That makes sense. Yeah.
so that's how it was.
I'd kind of like to follow up a little on that, what Gene was talking about. And I'm kind of jumping forward here to a great extent, but a couple of years later from after I got in and I was going through the Special Forces officer course. And we were probably about maybe 4 weeks into the course. And one day we walked in the JFK Center there for Special Warfare. And they checked everybody's ID going into the classroom and all that stuff. Once we got in, they locked the door, posted guards, did all kinds of stuff, and that type thing. Make sure nobody had any, at that point in time, recording equipment.
Sure.
And it wasn't like what we have today. You had something that was as big as that
Size of
toolbox over there if you were trying to
Briefcase.
record something. But then once they got us in there, and then they had this, I'm an old grizzly captain. He was the direct commission guy from somewhere down the road. And all of a sudden, he just started ranting and raving about the establishment and the way these people treat us. And we're the ones that's out there doing all the hard work, getting the dog shit kicked out of us every day and everything else. And they're getting all the stuff and everything else. And after about 2 hours of this stuff, we're ready for a rebellion. We're ready to go out here and say, look, all you generals up here don't know what the hell you're doing. We're getting ready to take over, and we're going to get our share. And so just about the time we're ready to break the door down and go outside, he says, okay, gentlemen, guess what I did? You just got the basic introduction to communism.
Wow.
Yeah.
He said, that's why these poor people are so hard to convince that it's not a good deal. And
Wow.
said they don't understand it's not a good deal until we put bullet holes in their chest. But that was one of the very, very unique things about our training in the Special Forces was they said, if you're going to combat communism, you better understand it.
Right.
You better know how to combat it.
Wow.
And that type of thing. So, we were converts. We were, sign me up.
A lesson to be had.
True. One of the things, too, kind of piggyback on what he just said, was that, and this was taught to us, was that they would get a book, just a regular, any book. And they would ramp and rage about, the great Satan or whatever the thing was and what have you. And it would be Sears and Roebuck catalog.
Okay.
But they would show it to these individuals that didn't know how to read and write. It says so right here.
Yeah.
It says so right here. It says so. In the print, you have to believe that.
Man.
So that was our teaching method at the time. Of
Sure.
course, things have has evolved, but at the time, it was very effective. Very effective.
Yeah.
And at the time, and Trav and I can relate to this, a lot of our teammates were DPs, displaced personnel from Europe.
Sure.
From World War II. And you would walk into your ODA, and you would have Wisniewski, Kropik, Bojan, and you go, is there a Smith or a Brown here?
Yeah.
Every one of them, would have, it was just Eastern European names. We had, in my particular team, we had Jerry Kropik, World War II German paratrooper.
Wow.
Yes.
Interesting.
That is crazy.
My team sergeant was in the Hitler Youth when he was 13 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
So
Very
I
interesting.
gotta dissect that a little bit here. How's this work? We obviously don't hear about this ever.
This was under the Lodge Act, 1954, was it?
54 maybe.
54, 55, whatever it was.
With Operation Paperclip, that type of thing?
I think so.
Yeah.
And it was where they would bring in displaced Europeans and they go, hey, you want to become an American citizen? Oh, yes. Well, join the Army. And that would be, it was a pathway to citizenship.
And see, at that point in time, we were really pointed toward, the Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
And all of these guys had come from that part. So we could turn around and put them back in that country. They grew up in those villages.
Oh, yeah.
They knew all of the history. They had the right dialect. They sound like natives. They were not, quote, spies. These guys could go undercover and work over there extremely effectively. And you didn't have to indoctrinate them about fighting communism because they lived under it.
Right.
They understood.
They hated it.
And
already.
they were ready to go back because they still had family back there.
90% of 10th Group at that
Yes.
time were displaced,
We're DPs.
were
No
DPs.
kidding.
Oh, yeah.
Did you happen to have conversations with them about the ideology that they came
yes.
from? Like Hitler Youth, you said. What was the conversations like with him, and then walking him into the democracy that you had in the '60s?
Well, as a young man, and I'm sure you can understand this, he was totally indoctrinated to the German way of life,
Sure.
and that type thing. And he was being in the Hitler Youth was kind of like what we did when we were 14
Boy
or
Scouts.
15,
Boy Scouts.
going to the Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Except they almost got deployed. Very fortunately,
end,
they
right?
surrendered before his unit got deployed in Berlin. And his, quote, sister unit did get deployed, and most of them got killed.
It's an interesting conversation that we have about that indoctrination,
Right.
and how people are like, I would never fall for that, and that's not entirely true at all. I think it's situational and environmental.
If
We had-
that's what you grew up with, and your father and your grandmother and your mother
Yes.
taught you, that's fact.
That's
That-
absolutely.
there's no question.
If I grew up in India, I wouldn't come from a Christian background. I'd come from a Muslim.
That's exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And
That's-
we had, for example, in my team, we had 2 Hungarian freedom fighters.
Really?
Yeah.
That is so interesting.
And so they taught us, I mean, they were not woke, I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah.
They
Sure.
were tough, and I mean, they were tough.
Yeah.
For an example, it was very, very cold, and I was there with Jerry Kropik, and I complained about it being cold. And he said, Pugh, you don't know what cold really is. And I was about to say something, and then I remembered that Jerry was at Stalingrad. I said, you're right, Jerry. I don't know diddly squat about being cold.
That's humbling.
Yes, these people would humble you in a nanosecond.
Yeah. I can imagine.
So they would put their arms around you, literally, and just take you under their wing and make sure that you were going to survive.
I was telling some young people the other day, well, it's been probably a few months ago, and it didn't really dawn on me until I thought about this, because we were watching some movie about D-Day and that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, it's just a light bulb came off in my head that when I was a young lieutenant and all of my senior officers and senior NCOs jumped on D-Day.
Wow.
I mean, those guys had been there, done that.
Yeah.
So those are the boys that are
And
teaching
I mean,
Oh, yeah.
we got mentored really, really well. We had some great teachers.
We did.
And like Gene said, don't be complaining about it cold, boys, because I've been cold and
Oh,
you're
yeah.
not cold right now.
Oh, yeah.
Now, hump
Yeah.
that, get that rucksack on and let's go.
Yeah.
Our Recon Sergeant Major, Charlie Vickers,
Bashed on.
17
Battle of
years
the Bulge.
old, Big Red 1, D-Day,
Yeah.
Wow.
those were our guys. I mean, there was a sergeant major when I was going through training group, and I wish I could remember his name, but he showed up and he had a 101st combat patch, right shoulder. A couple of days later, I noticed that he had a 187 combat patch. Okay, didn't think too much of it. That Saturday or the following Saturday, we had an inspection. You ever heard the word COB? Continued on back? That was his rack.
Yeah, his ribbon rack.
His ribbon, I mean, it was continued on back. And then I noticed very carefully his jump wings. He had Master Blaster wings. 4 combat jumps. Of course, I'm going with D-Day, Market Garden with the 101st.
Jesus.
And then I'm thinking again, he did the 2 with the 187 in Korea.
So all the major.
All the major
conflicts,
jumps. I mean, and I think you met some of the guys that had that jump in North Africa. Yeah, he did. And so
So
yeah,
you're
I mean,
coming from just an absolute legacy here of
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
absolute heroes to what you think at the time.
right.
Question for you guys: as you're going through your training, they're very oriented into the specifics of their type of combat. We're going into jungle warfare here. So how did that training regimen kind of shift? And I know that there was a lot of adaptation that needed to happen for that.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Kropik. We were going on an FTX. And he put for some reason or other, he took a liking to me. Put his arm on my shoulder. He said, "What you see?" And I had no clue. I mean, no clue. And I did not want to be on his bad side. And so I just took a wild ass guess. Ambush? Yeah. Good. I got 1 brownie point.
Yeah.
Where machine gun? So I'm looking around, I go, over there. He says, good. Why there? I go, field of fire, and went through the whole thing. And he goes, where you hide? Over here. Why here? Well, there's a depression. How you attack? Well, there's a blind spot over here. So he wanted me to analyze the whole situation. We'd go another 75 yards, put his hand on my shoulder. What you see? Ambush. Now I know, So I do the whole thing. Now I go 75 yards, 100 yards. I stop. Ambush, machine gun there. And I start doing my thing. Good. Because of men like him, we're still alive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because he saw that over and over, I'm sure.
He did, and they pressed you on it. And this was live, on the spot thinking.
Yeah.
And he would wait when you were tired.
Man.
So not only are you being effectively trained on ambushes, but
Right.
to spot them as well,
spot
to
them.
think
Yeah.
about the potential of a threat being there,
Right.
which gives you that extra couple seconds of pause,
Right.
Yeah.
which ultimately saved your life in a training environment.
Training environment. correct.
We were told and taught to be part of the jungle.
Yeah.
Once you got on the ground, of course, immediately once you get on the ground, it's deathly quiet.
Sure.
But after you've been on the ground for 20 minutes or so, you better start hearing the jungle noises coming back, the monkeys chattering, the birds flying around and that kind of stuff, and just the general noises that go on. And as you move through the jungle, you had to try to keep those noises going, because when it got quiet, you better get really sharp,
Yeah.
because there's something else causing those animals to get quiet.
Sure.
And those are the things they taught us, that there's a guy that's a legend in the Special Forces called Mad Dog Shriver.
Oh, yeah.
Jerry
Mad Dog,
Shriver.
Jerry Shriver.
And one of his one time said, you know, the unique thing about Jerry Shriver was he was just like having a dog you could talk to.
Yeah.
That he was so good in the woods. You know, he could smell them, he could track them, he could do it all. He said it was just like having a dog that you could sit down and ask questions. And so that's how we were trained. And again, a lot of our instructors were these DPs and people like that that grew up in some really difficult things and learned those skills.
Yeah.
And they would impart them to us. And they were quite good. Fortunately, we were smart enough to pay a pretty good bit of attention. You know,
Yeah.
we're like most young people. We thought we knew everything, but we didn't know everything. So we were smart enough to listen every once in a while and pay attention.
You kind of hear about those sixth senses, especially in Vietnam, where, I mean, you could smell, you could almost taste the enemy. Just having that hair go up on the back of your neck. Can you talk a little bit about what that's like when you get off the bird, you land, it's all quiet, you got to get the jungle back to chattering, and how dynamic that difference is while you're walking through that?
Well, in our situation where we were running those small 6-man recon teams, your point man, again, he had to be just like an old hound dog up there. And I don't know if you guys ever know it, but in Vietnam, they made a sauce. It was called Nuc Mam, and it was made out of, they put little fish like minnows in a bag and let them rot, and they dripped, all the oil dripped out, and they cooked that, and that became Nuc Mam.
Okay.
Well, it's just like the Italians eating garlic. In the jungle, you could smell them
smell
100
those
meters
guys.
away,
Yeah.
and especially at night, when just a little bit of breeze is going, you could smell that Nuc Mam.
Yeah. So Gary O'Neill, are you familiar with him?
Yeah.
He kind of talks about that in his book, where he's like, I did not even eat. I ate local cuisine only because of that very reason.
That's right.
Smell like the enemy.
You know, don't worry about shaving. Don't put on any kind. Nothing. You want to. As a matter of fact, in our unit, you were allowed to run around unshaven, and most of us wouldn't take a shower 2 days before going on a mission. Right. So you would get any soap smell, because you can smell that stuff out there in the jungle.
Oh, yeah.
And so, you had to be, the thing is, you wanted to smell just like one of the mountain yards.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It smell like the enemy.
The thing about it was, for example, in my case, I was born and raised in Panama, Central America. So the jungle was home to me.
Sure.
It was home to me. And again, the same thing, the birds, the insects, and so on and so forth, the monkeys, they were your sentries. They were your sentries. And they'd go quiet real quick. Immediately you stopped. I mean, I don't care where you were, whatever you did, you stopped. And then in our team, 6 or 8-man team, each one had an area. I'm going to look 12 to 2, 2 to 4, so on and so forth. Everybody had their little area of what they're going to be looking at. And during that time period, you're praying that God, let it be a deer or snake or whatever.
Sure.
But you're listening, and you're trying to smell. And sometimes it'd be nothing. It would be nothing, and that's when it spooks you, is that nothing. And you go, what was it?
Is it nothing?
Is it nothing? Maybe a tiger or something. We don't know, and all of a sudden the jungle noises come back on, and we're all looking at each other like, You know, pucker factor gets a little tighter.
And
And yeah,
in our SOP, and we'll probably go into this later on when I was the OIC of the 1-0 school, but you once you were on the ground, unless you were in a firefight, there was no talking.
no, none at all.
Everything was done with hand and arm signals, and and we did what we called IA drill, immediate action drills. We spent probably 65% of all of our training time doing IA drills, so that when that first round was fired, every single man knew exactly what to do. As Gene said, everybody knew his quadrant. Everybody knew exactly what to do, when to reload, when to fall back, when to fire a full magazine, when to go to individual shots. And you practiced and you practiced and you practiced. And when you had it absolutely perfect, you practiced some more. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And that's what saved your life.
Absolutely.
I had so many people tell me later on that that's the thing, that first 10, 15 seconds of a firefight determines 90% of how it's going to turn out.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting to compare and contrast conventional infantrymen versus your special forces. And you could see that in the training specifically because you're doing repetitive drills, repetitive motion over and over again, right?
Right. And see, like when we were on our mission, we were 17 miles deep into Laos, and there was no help. There wasn't nobody coming after you.
Yeah.
It took an hour for the helicopters to get to you. So, I mean, you were on your own. You had to save yourself.
Yeah.
There was no cavalry coming after you.
And then not only that, but let's say that we would launch out of Da Nang, and then we would fly to NKP, which was Nakhon Phanom in Thailand. We would switch over to a Jolly Green or a Super Jolly, and then we'd go north. That was a long time before you'd get a bird over you.
Yeah.
You were on your own, and you had to conserve ammo, and your guns were your A1s, because they had the range, of course, and they had the firepower. And so that was basically it. Each area, if you had, let's say, one of the shorter targets, and I'm using the term shorter targets, meaning from the Vietnamese border into Laos. Okay. And let's say you were 5 miles in, okay? You were still outside of artillery.
Yeah.
And then the maps that we had were the old French maps.
Okay.
So
Okay.
very, very dated, I'm sure.
They were dated, and they were off by what, 1 or 2 clicks or more.
Oh.
I kid you not.
Yeah.
So that just adds to the terrifying factor.
Right.
Yeah. You have no idea where
It
you're
wasn't
at.
until later, thanks to him, that we were able then to get Air Force maps that were photographs and they just put grids on them. Thank God for him to do that. Because before, I put my hand on the Bible on it. Because if he didn't do it, we were getting these green sheets of paper with grids on it. And you would come back and you get, during the debriefing, and they'd say, well, where did you cross the river? What river? Well, there's a river right here on the map, and you were inserted here and you were extracted over here. You had to cross the river. There was no river.
No river.
Now listen to me, Sergeant. Okay, blue means river, right? Yeah. Yeah. So, map reading course. Right. You see that line there? That's a river. Now let's go over it again, Sergeant Pugh. You got inserted over here, right? Right. It says, you got extracted over there, right? It says, how deep was the river? There was no river.
Yeah, I'm not wet.
So yeah, we had issues like that.
Sure.
Or sometimes, well, we got put in there and then we crossed the river and we got picked up over there. Do you see a river there, Mr. Sergeant Pugh? No, but there was a river there that we crossed.
And how do you, how do you get past that? There's got to be points where you're like, where the hell am I?
You
Just keep walking.
You deal with what you got.
Deal with what you
that's
got,
right.
yeah.
You continue the mission.
And not only that, but sometimes because of the terrain, it would be raining, let's say, 3 or 4 miles away. Of course, rain goes downhill. End up have a river where you are. It's raining over there. Now you have a little creek or whatever.
Interesting.
And
Or
over in Laos, I was telling somebody yesterday, as a matter of fact, every day at 4 o'clock, it's going to rain.
Yeah.
I promise you, it's going to rain
Yeah.
at 4 o'clock. And when it rains, you think you're going to drown standing up. I've never seen it rain that hard.
I think
before.
Forrest Gump has a great kind of saying in there where it's raining sideways down, sideways
yeah.
up,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And and then of course, as Gene says, especially if you're up in the mountainous area in Laos, it all comes downhill. And so, okay, there might be a river there now. 20 minutes from now, it may not be.
Yeah.
Or 20 minutes ago, there wasn't one.
Sure.
So it was an ever-changing situation.
Yeah, landscape.
And so and part of our job, again, we became updaters to the maps.
Sure.
Yeah.
So when we would come back, part of the debriefing, we'd go over into the S2 shop and we'd say, okay, this particular object is not there, but it may be over here somewhere, and that type of thing. So we would update the maps as we went in.
Yeah, it's real-time intelligence, though.
Yeah, not only that, but also trails. For example, one of the guys from FOB2 out of Khartoum reported some noise, and they waited and waited. Sure enough, there was this elephant, and noticed a man on top of the elephant. And then he noticed that there were about 3 or 4 elephants behind him, behind the elephant. They were going in the jungle. Elephants go in single file. And behind the elephants was a company or a battalion of guys. The elephants were making the trail. In 2 weeks, that trail would be gone. It would grow up.
Wow. That's so interesting.
And so the important thing is, and travel will tell you this, and that is the importance of elephants, meaning that they're carrying heavy loads, artillery or something of that nature. So
And under triple canopy jungle, you couldn't even see the trail.
from the air.
Aircraft flying over couldn't see the trail. And that's the old maps that we had were made that way. They went over, took some pictures, and
Estimated.
so there may be a river underneath this triple canopy,
Yeah.
but you can't see it.
Can't see it.
So interesting. Now, Gene, you mentioned that Travis made some updates to the maps.
Yeah.
So what was this?
They were photographed. They
Okay.
were he would call the Air Force and tell them, photograph this particular area, and then they'll put the grids on it. Because the
Okay.
maps that we had at the time, like I was mentioning,
Yeah.
they were just green sheets of paper
Well, it's a very interesting concept.
with grids superimposed on it.
Yeah.
And so when we would get debriefed, going to the river situation, where'd you see the river? Well, there's no river there.
Yeah.
Or there is a river.
Yeah.
Well, it's just an interesting concept for you to come up with that. Was that something you did early in your career, or was that later after you?
Well, it was while I
commissioned?
was at Longton
Okay.
and down there because I had some very close working relationships with the Air Force down
Okay.
there. And so it was just kind of one of those things where we were sitting around in the club one night, and I was complaining about how outdated the maps are and all that kind of stuff, and he says, "Oh, we got a way to make maps like that." I said,
Perfect.
"You do?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Can you get me some of those made?" He said, "Yeah, you just tell me where you want them."
Yeah.
So
That's incredible.
Yeah.
You know.
Developing your own
Funny
assets.
thing, you should-
Let me tell you, now here's a true Special Forces deal. We flew on what was called Blackbirds, the black C-130s that you had to have a TS clearance just to be on. And there were certain places in that C-130, the curtain, you didn't go behind the curtain no matter what your security clearance was or anything else. There was only one place in Southeast Asia they could be worked on, and that was in the Philippines.
Okay.
So once every 2 or 3 months, these C-130s had to go back and get all their electronics and stuff like that updated and worked on. Well, of course, they would the Blackbirds made what we called a milk run. They left out of Saigon or left out of Da Nang. They were based in Da Nang. And they would go up to Phu Bai, they'd go all the way up, come down, and at that time we had 6 FOBs, and they would stop at each one of the FOBs, and that's how we just had material and people that got shuttled around every day.
Okay.
Well, the air crew, they left very, very early in the morning, and they didn't get back until around midnight every day. And so I've been up, when I was in Long Con, we'd been up to Kontum, and we were coming back. And so we were loading all our stuff up on the C-130 and all of that. And we were heading back in. And we got about, we stopped at Ton Son Nhut in Saigon, and then we were about 30-minute flight from Saigon. And so I got on the horn and I called to camp, and I told them, I said, that we're coming in, we're going to be a little bit late this afternoon, so have us some sandwiches and all that kind of stuff at the mess hall when we get back in, because we hadn't had anything to eat all day. And so they said, okay, fine, no problem. And we had really good mess crew there. And so something came up as I was talking on the phone. The crew chief was standing there, and he says, man, that sandwich sounds good. I said, you guys don't have anything to eat? He said, no, we leave in the morning and the mess hall's not open. They won't fix us any boxed lunches. And he said, we don't get nothing to eat till we get back home. So I got back on the horn and I called back and I said, look, how many is in your crew? And they said 8. And I said, okay, fix me 16 sandwiches and give me 16 Coca-Colas and meet me at the aircraft. And they said, okay. And so they did. And I gave it to them. And man, they was very, very grateful. The pilot, everybody was so grateful and all of that. I said, you guys do this every day? He says, well, we don't, but somebody does. I said, you tell them to call us when they get out, when they hit Ton Son Nhut, and we'll have it ready for you every day. I promise you that.
Yeah.
So when about a month after that, I got a call one day from one of the pilots. And he says, hey, we're going to be stopping out in Ton Son Nhut, and we got to go back to the Philippines to get our plane worked on. He said, if you want to, you stop by, and we'll stop by your airport down there. We had a little airfield right outside of our camp.
Okay.
And he says, if you'll give us some money, we'll bring you a pallet of San Miguel beer back. I mean, there was no San Miguel beer in Vietnam.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, everything else was 3-2 beer. It was, junk stuff.
Yeah.
So, man, I went in and I talked to the mess sergeant. I said, hey, we had slush fund. I need some money. I need X number of dollars, and I'm going to give these guys. They went back to the Philippines. We got 2 pallets of San Miguel beer. Let me tell you. You talk about trading material, that was solid gold.
Oh, I'm sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
That was
every
gold.
general's, dog robber was down there wanting some San Miguel beer for
I
his
bet.
general. And I said, well, we kind of need some favors. We need this and we need
Yeah.
that. We need some of this over here. Well, I don't know. I said, well, I don't know about the beer. And they said, okay. So we had a good working relationship with the Air Force.